Roderick A. Elmheim stood atop a hill piled with corpses, his entire body emanating a thick aura of bloodshed. Gazing toward the distant white snowfield, he identified the person before him as Ash. He then turned his head slightly and questioned why Ash was present, stating that he distinctly remembered entrusting him with the expedition to conquer the East. Clutching his wounded arm, his face smeared with blood, Ash responded with barely restrained fury that he had come for the sole purpose of striking Roderick down. The moment those words were uttered, Roderick's eyes flared with crimson light as he stared back at him. Facing his adoptive father with a blood-stained sword in hand, Ash accused him of having intended from the very beginning to use his unit as a decoy and discard them once they had served their purpose, asking bitterly whether that assessment was wrong. With golden eyes filled with hatred, Ash addressed him as his father. Roderick frowned, clearly displeased, and coldly replied that such a fate was the only purpose of a wingless existence like Ash, deriding him as a foolish son. He then spoke Ash's full name with deliberate emphasis. Ash's thoughts drifted to the crimson family crest of the House of Elmheim, the continent's foremost military lineage that had long pledged its sword to protect the royal family. He recalled how the head of that house, Roderick A. Elmheim, had been revered as the sole bearer of the 7 wings in the entire country. He remembered the image of Roderick standing tall beneath the family emblem, seated in the seat of authority, and then another memory surfaced, of Roderick rescuing him on a whim when he had been a dying infant abandoned in a blizzard beside a woman. Ash reflected that it was precisely because of that act that he had spent his entire life doing everything he could to repay that debt. Yet another memory followed, of himself lying collapsed on the ground, blood covering his face, a shattered wooden sword by his side, while his 2 brothers stood nearby, laughing mockingly. He recalled how, in their youth, they had ridiculed him, declaring that a wingless person without even a crest had no right to overestimate himself. Ash concluded bitterly that he had lacked the wings necessary to repay his father. His thoughts turned to the wing crests engraved upon Roderick's back, and the belief that the more wings one possessed, the greater the magical power hidden within. He reflected with anguish that as the only member of the ducal house incapable of using magic, he had been labeled wingless by his brothers. Even so, Ash had done nothing but desperately cling to his sword. He remembered how he had trained relentlessly with wooden stakes, how he had stripped himself bare and performed endless push-ups until sweat pooled on the ground, and how he had continued strengthening his body even through storms and violent rain, driven solely by the belief that one day such devotion would be rewarded. That belief led him to the present battlefield, where he had fought alongside his 2 brothers in a snowy forest. He recalled hiding behind a tree, carefully watching his surroundings, until all 3 of them were shocked by the sudden appearance of numerous enemy forces. Someone had cried out in disbelief that they were being ambushed. Returning to the present, Ash questioned Roderick, saying that he had followed him and believed in him until this very moment, and demanded to know whether this betrayal was the answer he had been given. Roderick looked down at him with blood-red eyes, regarding him as nothing more than an insect, and replied that a mere tool like Ash had no right to expectations, ordering him to leave immediately as an eyesore. Hearing those merciless words, Ash fell into silence. Then, without hesitation, he charged forward with his sword, still addressing Roderick as his father. With eyes gleaming in golden murderous intent, he swung his blade, bitterly acknowledging his own foolishness for having believed in him. He poured every last ounce of strength into that strike, lamenting that trusting Roderick had been his greatest mistake. However, the attack only left a shallow cut along the collar of Roderick's clothing, prompting Roderick to sneer in disdain. At that moment, Ash's 2 brothers used magic to conjure crimson chains that bound his body completely. Their eyes shone with cruel amusement as they swung their swords, severing one of Ash's arms and one of his legs. Bound and assaulted from all sides, Ash spat out a mouthful of blood. As he collapsed face first into the snow, his eldest brother mocked him, remarking that Ash still failed to understand his place, sneering that a wingless being was destined for such an end. Standing together with Roderick, the second brother added that someone like Ash was best suited to crawl on the ground like that. Clenching his remaining hand, Ash trembled with rage, and weakly questioned why he had ever been picked up if he was only meant to be discarded in the end. Roderick then squatted in front of him and coldly told him not to flatter himself, stating that he had never had any use for Ash from the very beginning. Grabbing Ash by the hair and forcing his head up, Roderick revealed through clenched teeth that what had truly mattered was the power of the 7 wings residing within Ash's body. Confused, Ash questioned what Roderick meant by the 7 wings. Roderick released him and mockingly replied that Ash's mother had been truly useful. Turning away, he added that she had given birth to a seed like Ash solely for his sake. As Roderick's back gradually disappeared into the distance, Ash desperately reached out and begged him to wait, demanding to know what he was talking about. Meanwhile, his 2 brothers raised their swords high above him, killing intent surging, while Ash continued to plead for answers. After an indeterminate amount of time, Ash's vision blurred and he became aware of a single hand lying in a pool of blood, sensing only the cold. Struggling to open his fading eyes, he wondered whether this was where he would die. Watching the snow fall endlessly from the sky, Ash questioned, in the depths of his fading consciousness, what he had truly been living for all this time. Suddenly, the church bells began to ring. Wrapped in swaddling clothes, the boy silently assessed his situation, sensing that everything around him was white and faintly warm, and wondering whether this was the afterlife, or perhaps snow. Moments later, Ash let out a loud sneeze. Widening his round eyes in confusion, he quickly realized that it was not the afterlife at all, but reality itself. As the bells continued to echo, he discovered that he was lying in the arms of a woman, which made him jolt in shock as he wondered where on earth he was. When he tried to move his foot, he questioned the tiny body he was inhabiting. Raising his small finger, he doubted whether it truly belonged to him, noting that it was unmistakably the body of an infant. Only then did Ash panic upon realizing that he had become a complete baby. After some time, once he had reluctantly accepted this reality, he began to look around. Seeing the woman holding him, Ash quietly speculated whether she was dead. At that moment, when he instinctively triggered a search, clusters of small, golden lights appeared. Through them, Ash saw a group of people on horseback galloping through the snow, shouting that the woman had to be found at all costs, insisting that in such a blizzard she could not have fled very far. The captain, frowning deeply, shouted to the soldiers behind him that for Lord Roderick's sake they had to recover the infant she had taken. When the golden lights gradually faded, Ash was so terrified that cold sweat broke out all over his body. Thinking about the name Roderick, he was inwardly shaken, questioning what had just happened and whether they had truly mentioned Lord Roderick. He realized with dread that the man was after the baby, and immediately associated that baby with himself, wondering if they were searching for him. His golden eyes widened in fear as he recalled having heard that he himself had once been picked up on a snowy night just like this. That memory made him suspect the absurd possibility that he had returned to the past, even though the idea felt utterly ridiculous. When the golden lights appeared again, and the image of the horseman charging through the snow re-emerged, Ash flinched and glanced in one direction, deciding that he would confirm everything later. He then twisted his body, struggling to escape from the stiffened arms of the woman, telling himself that if he stayed there, he would inevitably fall into the hands of the ducal house. Fear transformed into motivation, and drenched in sweat, Ash stretched his hand forward. Golden spiritual energy surged from his entire body as he began crawling ahead inch by inch, gritting his teeth with determination, and telling himself that he had to get away from there as far and as quickly as possible. His tiny hand slammed against the snowy ground, causing steam to rise. As he continued crawling, he cursed inwardly, feeling his breathing grow heavy. With each movement, his hands radiated more heat, melting the snow beneath them, and he sensed that his limbs were so hot they felt as though they were burning. He had no idea how much time passed, but eventually he realized that he had carved a long trench across the snow. Encouraging himself, he resolved to survive even if he had to crawl the entire way. With his face filthy and his body soaked in sweat, he clenched his teeth and continued forward, reaffirming his determination to live. As he recalled the image of himself reaching toward Roderick's retreating back, Ash vowed inwardly that he would one day take everything from Lord Roderick. However, his vision gradually darkened, even as he continued reaching forward. In the end, his body went limp and collapsed onto the snow. Sometime later, a pair of feet stopped in front of him. A white-haired girl turned back toward the man behind her and called out to her father, indicating that she had found something. Baron Highfield frowned in shock and exclaimed in disbelief. He lifted Ash into his arms, questioning why there would be a baby in a place like this. As he looked closely at Ash, he suddenly noticed something unusual, and his eyes widened in horror as he realized that it truly was an infant. When he looked at the long path carved through the snow, Baron Highfield was stunned, wondering whether the child had really crawled such an incredible distance. Breaking out in a cold sweat, he stared at the sleeping Ash in his arms and questioned who on earth this child could be. And so, Ash was picked up by a mysterious figure, while the man continued to wonder, in utter disbelief, who this child truly was. In his dream, Ash saw a red-haired child pointing toward him and wondered where that place was and who the child was. The child, with large blue eyes, reached out toward him, and Ash inwardly affirmed that the child had come to meet him. Suddenly, while Ash was still half asleep and murmuring that it was an angel, he was startled awake when a small hand grabbed his nose. When he opened his eyes, he saw the curious faces of children of various ages looking down at him. Some of them excitedly exclaimed that the little one had just opened his eyes, while another told them not to tease him or they would pull off his cute little nose. A chaotic scuffle among the children followed, with some grabbing his arms and others pulling at his legs, making Ash turn pale as he wondered what in the world that situation was. Eventually, the eldest sister had to embrace him and protect him from the other children. However, Ash suddenly could not endure it any longer and leapt out of her arms, startling everyone. Crawling on the ground, he stretched his hand forward, trying to escape, and agonizingly wondered what was going on. Just then, the red-haired child shouted and rushed toward him. While the eldest sister hurriedly yelled for them to stop right there, the children ignored her and chased after Ash, forcing him to flee using magic while fearfully and resentfully wondering why they were chasing him. With a grim expression, Ash stretched out his hand as golden energy radiated from his entire body, and his pupils suddenly flashed. After a deafening explosion, Ash pierced through the ceiling and shot into the sky, inwardly wondering whether he was flying and realizing that it was magical power. However, unable to control his strength, he began to fall. Seeing the roof approaching within arm's reach, Ash flailed his limbs in terror as he thought that he could not control it and that he was falling. Helpless, he shut his eyes tightly and resigned himself to his fate. Yet, when no pain came, he cautiously opened his eyes and saw that he was being held in a man's arms. The man remarked that Ash was now falling out of the sky and that he truly was a strange child. Recognizing the man, Ash broke out in a cold sweat and inwardly panicked as he realized who he was. Seeing the man's stern demeanor, Ash became certain that he was Viscount Highfried, Duke Roderick's older brother. Thinking about the house he was currently in, Ash felt overwhelmed with confusion as he wondered if it could possibly be the other Elmheim household. He recalled that the man was Highfried A. Elmheim, the head of the Viscount family, a branch of the Elmheim lineage. Visualizing two golden swords clashing, Ash reviewed his knowledge of Viscount Highfried, remembering that he had once been, alongside his younger brother Roderick, one of the two pillars entrusted with protecting the royal family. However, Ash remembered that the Viscount Highfried he knew had died in a civil war, and that his death had caused the family portrait to shatter along with the fall of his house. Looking at his small hands in the present, Ash became certain that he had gone back to the past. He then held his forehead in disbelief and inwardly lamented that he had tried to escape the ducal house only to be taken in by the older brother instead. Ash suddenly flinched when Viscount Highfried's wife touched his face with a sympathetic expression and asked whether the child's magic had gone berserk and sent him flying. He then heard Viscount Highfried confirm that it seemed so, and that he had known the child was not an ordinary baby. Rather than being frightened by those words, the Viscountess gazed at Ash even more tenderly. She then hugged him more tightly and reassured him that it must have been frightening and that he was safe now. Stunned by such warmth, Ash widened his eyes and looked at her, while Viscount Highfried smiled gently from the side. Suddenly, the Viscount extended his hand toward Ash and stated that the child possessed unimaginable power. He then lifted the back of Ash's clothing and explained that the mark on his back was proof of that. Through the mirror in front of him, Ash saw the red mark on his back and inwardly gasped as he recognized it as the 7 wings. Seeing it clearly, Ash broke into a cold sweat as he wondered why it was on his body. Abruptly, he frowned and realized the truth in panic. Recalling a scene from his previous life in which Roderick had grabbed his hair and declared that what they needed was the power of the 7 wings dwelling within him, Ash finally understood. At the same time, he remembered the image of Roderick's large hand gripping the collar of his newborn self and pulling him out of a pile of snow, carrying the tiny Ash under his arm without a trace of affection. At that moment, recalling everything, Ash burned with anger as he thought that the man had picked him up only to steal the 7 wings, and bitterly remarked to himself that it was ironic for someone to call him wingless after tearing those wings off himself and still having the nerve to act that way. Suddenly, Lady Highfried, the Viscountess, lifted her head with a worried expression and asked her husband what they should do with the child. Viscount Highfried remained silent, frowning as he listened. Ash himself frowned, feeling anxious as he thought that the situation was bad. Clenching his small hand tightly, he resolutely told himself that he could not let that power fall into Elmheim's hands and that he needed that power to take revenge. Unexpectedly, Viscount Highfried declared that he would take the boy in as his adopted son. His words left Ash stunned in disbelief. The Viscount extended his hand toward him, gently patting Ash's head as he said that the child was still a fledgling who could not even fly on his own. Ash then saw 2 pairs of gentle eyes looking at him as the Viscount firmly stated that until the day the boy chose to take flight by his own will, he would take responsibility for raising him. Ash's eyes widened, filled with both emotion and astonishment. All of a sudden, a loud crash rang out as 2 girls fell face first into the room. Seeing his 5 children appear, Viscount Highfried asked whether the 2 of them had been listening. The eldest daughter sat up nervously and stammered that they had only been worried about the child. Shortly afterward, a red-haired little girl ran in while carrying a newborn sibling and called out to the Viscountess as her mother. Ignoring the baby, who was pushing against her face, she looked curiously at Ash in her mother's arms and asked what the child's name was. The Viscountess closed her eyes and smiled thoughtfully, saying that she would think about it. She then lifted Ash toward the window filled with silver moonlight and announced that his name would be Aster. explaining that it was the name of a new star being born into their house. Time passed swiftly. 10 years later, at a luxurious villa, soldiers stood in orderly rows in front of the gate to welcome an arriving carriage. A servant bowed to the man who stepped down and respectfully said that they had been expecting Lord Highfried. As he passed by, a boy stepped out of the carriage behind him. Astor appeared with a sword at his waist, standing upright. He then turned and politely extended his hand to help a red-haired girl step down, reminding her to watch her step and addressing her as Sister Alphine. The red-haired child who once grabbed Astor's nose had now grown into a beautiful young girl, and she smiled as she thanked him. Astor watched his youngest sister fondly as she walked ahead before he followed. As he imagined someone swinging a sword and releasing golden, lightning-like energy, Astor explained that the Sword Dance Assembly was a social gathering held annually by a certain ducal house under Elmheim. Imagining a girl performing a sword dance and creating blazing arc-shaped sword trails, he continued that it was an event for martial nobles. Finally, picturing a young man unleashing a sword strike carrying blue energy, Astor added that while it was a place for nobles to strengthen their connections, it was also a stage where each house showcased their promising young swordsmen who bore their family names. Afterward, Astor and Alphen followed Viscount Highfried into the villa. As they passed by, the surrounding crowd whispered that the Viscount's family had arrived again only to make fools of themselves since they had failed to produce an heir, adding that they had heard the family adopted some nobody boy from an unknown place. Red, scrutinizing eyes continued to glare at them as people mocked how much longer they would keep dragging the Elmheim name through the mud. Astor kept walking forward, ignoring those who targeted him as some of them remarked that he must be the boy in question. At one side, Alphen spoke up irritably to reassure him, telling him not to let it get to him. However, her tightly clenched, trembling hand revealed how angry she truly was as she continued by warning that in that place, the moment someone showed weakness, they would be finished. Astor glanced at her shaking hand. Suddenly, Viscount Highfried, who was walking ahead, spoke and drew Astor's attention by stating that this was the current standing of the Viscount's house. He then turned around, stood before the gate, and told Astor that he had wanted him to see this. Astor stood silently as he listened to the Viscount ask whether he was disappointed. With fiery eyes, Astor smiled and replied that he was not disappointed and that such a level of coldness suited him just fine. Hearing that, Highfried the Viscount laughed heartily and remarked that it was reassuring. Astor suddenly recalled the image of himself losing in his past life and thought that, in his past life, as the disgrace of House Elmheim, he had made the worst possible debut in high society, which was a place filled with bitter memories. In the present, as he gripped the sword at his waist, Astor thought confidently that now that the seven wings had returned, he was different. His cold eyes glanced toward a certain direction, where a lit window on a middle floor could be seen. The two sons of Roderick were standing by the window, looking outside with arrogant expressions. Astor tilted his head up and frowned. He resolutely followed his adoptive father into the building, telling himself that it was time to begin. With determined golden eyes, Astor curled his lips into a faint smile and declared that he would start with a dazzling high society debut. On the fencing stage, sparks flew after a series of loud clashes, as it was said that there had once been an era when knights ruled the world. A young swordsman gripped the hilt of his sword with both hands and, despite his injured face, gritted his teeth and launched another attack. His opponent, who was no less wounded, fought back resolutely, as it was believed that a knight had needed both power and grace. When their swords collided fiercely, the surrounding crowd cheered noisily, declaring that power had meant swordsmanship. The brown-haired boy forcefully knocked his opponent's sword aside, forcing him to step back and evade, while it was proclaimed that grace had meant fame. The two boys then charged at each other again, each carrying the will to defeat the other, as people claimed that there had been one thing that proved a knight possessed both qualities. Suddenly, a blue wing-shaped crest appeared on the back of the brown-haired boy's hand. He swung his sword infused with energy and struck toward his opponent, shattering the other boy's blade. At the same time, his opponent widened his eyes in shock and gaped in disbelief as he lost the match. The brown-haired boy raised his sword high and received thunderous cheers from the crowd, while it was declared that the ultimate symbol of everything had been the wing crest, which now shone brilliantly on the back of his hand. From the observation floor, Alphen rested her chin on her hand and remarked that the place was still insanely intense. Thinking about her two older sisters at home, she waved her hand dismissively and commented that it was no wonder Sister Fren and Sister Flare had not wanted to come. Beside her, Astor's expression darkened with sadness as he recalled the mocking laughter from his previous life. Back then, he had been just like the defeated boy, with his sword shattered as he hung his head before his adoptive older brother. Suddenly, Alphine leaned over and called out to Astor, asking if he was nervous since it was his first sword dance festival. Astor smiled brightly and denied it, saying that he honestly was not, though he thought to himself that, if anything, it felt nostalgic. Hearing this, Alphine looked at him with suspicion. At that moment, Viscount Highfried announced that he would step away briefly for a meeting and asked Aster to take care of Alphine for him. This immediately made Alphine protest angrily, arguing that she was more capable than Aster, while Aster responded with a helpless smile, remarking that his sister was too clumsy. Viscount Highfried then placed a hand on Aster's shoulder and, with a smile, advised him that there were many kids his age there and that he should make some connections while he could. However, as he passed by Aster, he lowered his voice and seriously warned him not to let anyone discover the secret of the 7 wings. Watching Viscount Highfried walk away, Aster thought that although that was what he said, the hostile gazes filled with malicious intent from all directions made him wonder about it. Scratching his head casually, he questioned to himself how he was supposed to connect with others when the hostility was so blatant. Suddenly, Aster glanced toward a certain direction. Seeing him leave, Alphine called out in confusion, asking where he was going. Without turning back, he replied that he was going to make friends. At the same time, in a private area where Roderick's 2 sons sat on a long bench, many young nobles surrounded them. When Aster approached, Darius held up a glass of wine and rudely demanded to know who the hell he was. Aster neither fawned nor flattered him and instead politely greeted him, saying it was nice to meet his brother-in-law Darius. He then smiled brightly and introduced himself as Aster F. Elmheim, adding that he was their younger brother. Darius frowned as Aster continued by explaining that he had seen him from outside and had come to say hello. Sitting beside him, Grion pointed and mocked Aster, telling Darius that Aster was the adopted child the Viscount's family had taken in. Immediately, Darius brushed his hair back and laughed mockingly, stating that he understood and sarcastically remarking that it explained how Aster could shamelessly call himself F. Remembering the final moments of his past life, Aster thought that Darius and Grion had been the 2 legitimate heirs of House Elmheim and the ones who had killed him in his previous life. Pressing his lips together, he reflected that they had once seemed terrifying, but now they simply looked like children pretending to be adults as they sat surrounded by several other noble youths. Suddenly, a voice calling his name snapped him out of his thoughts. Alphine grabbed his wrist and urged him to come back, asking whether he had already greeted them. Just as she turned around, a voice called out from behind them, greeting Alphine and asking whether she was there as well. Darius raised his eyebrow and sneered as he taunted her, asking whether she did not need to hide behind her father that day and ordering her to come over and entertain them, adding that it was an order from the main house. Alphine stopped walking but did not turn back. She suddenly glared at them and firmly refused, stating that the main and branch families were not in a master-servant relationship. She then decisively pulled Aster away, causing him to stammer that he still had something to say. However, he stopped speaking when he felt the trembling hand gripping his wrist. Aster frowned, his eyes filled with sadness. Even so, Darius did not let them go and, with a twisted laugh, shouted as he asked if they knew what. Watching the 2 of them pull each other away, Darius mocked them by saying that her father had been a knight but had failed to protect the king, and that to take responsibility, his own younger brother had cut off his arm. Hearing this, Alphine's expression darkened and she stopped walking. Not stopping there, Darius continued to sneer, thanking God that he did not share that loser's blood, which made Alphine grind her teeth as she abruptly turned to glare at him. Alphine then released Aster's hand and aggressively stepped toward Darius, demanding that he take that back. However, when she threatened that if he was going to speak trash about her father, she would not allow it, Darius did not hesitate to spit the wine from his mouth directly into her face. Watching the wine drip down her body, Darius looked at her with contempt and said that all her father had ended up with were useless daughters who could not even inherit a barony, adding that he bet her father must have been deeply disappointed in her. He then pointed his empty wineglass toward her with disdain and remarked that this was not a ballroom, telling her that next time she should come dressed in a way that would not make her mind getting soaked, suggesting that she should just throw on some rags or something. Alphine's eyes filled with tears as she lowered her head, staring at her dress, now stained with wine, feeling utterly humiliated. From behind, Aster watched Alphine being humiliated by them and thought that he had been worried on the way there. As he observed the noble brats holding wine bottles and laughing, he told himself that he had thought that perhaps seeing their faces again would mean that he would not feel any anger anymore. Suddenly, Aster stepped forward and snatched the wine bottle from their hands. He then walked up and placed a hand on Alphine's shoulder to comfort her, while inwardly admitting that he was glad. Aster threw the bottle toward his cousin and called out to Darius. Darius frowned but still caught the bottle. At the same time, Aster slashed the bottle in half with his sword, causing the liquid inside to splash everywhere, while cursing internally that Darius was still the same piece of trash as ever. The entire contents of the bottle poured over Darius's head, making him shriek in shock. As Grion lunged forward, shouting worriedly for his brother, Aster calmly raised his hand and wiped the wine from his blade. He then stuck out his tongue and licked the drop of wine on his thumb, wondering aloud whether it was just grape juice. With cold eyes, Aster curled his lips into a mocking smirk, remarking that it suited a spoiled little noble like Darius perfectly. On a certain day 3 years earlier, as Aster lowered his head slightly while his energy erupted violently due to losing control, Viscount Highfried shouted for someone to hold Aster back and demanded to know whether he was trying to kill his sisters. The Viscount's eldest daughter clung to her younger sister, tearfully and fearfully screaming for her to stay with her. Meanwhile, the other 3 daughters of Viscount Highfried huddled together in a corner in terror as they heard their father shout at Aster to pull himself together. At the same time, as Aster's surging energy continued to spread, he thought that this was the 7 Wings and admitted that he had never imagined it concealed such dangerous power. Viscount Highfried, holding his sword in front of Aster, wondered internally whether it could truly be controlled by him. As he observed his adopted son in a vacant state, with golden energy violently bursting from his body, he worried inwardly about Aster as well. In the present, while inside the council chamber, Viscount Highfried was startled when a servant rushed in shouting that the situation was urgent. Everyone in the room turned toward the servant, and one person demanded to know the meaning of the interruption, reminding him that they were in the middle of talks. The servant stammered nervously before reporting, while both Roderick and Viscount Highfried frowned and listened, that the sons of the main house and branch house of Elmheim were dueling. Upon hearing this, Viscount Highfried exclaimed in shock, questioning what had happened, while Roderick darkened in expression and remained silent in displeasure. Soon after, Viscount Highfried abruptly stood up and walked outside. At that moment, someone called out to him as father. When he saw Alphine running toward him in panic, he anxiously asked what on earth had happened. As Viscount Highfried placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder to calm her, a nobleman with a face resembling a wolverine suddenly laughed excitedly and pointed out something below. The Viscount and his daughter looked down toward the dueling platform, where 2 young men stood facing each other with swords. The nobleman continued by remarking that it was a brotherly feud within the mighty house of Elmheim, and noted that such a sight was rare. Crossing his arms, he excitedly speculated that everything depended on how the duel would end. Meanwhile, Viscount Highfried and Alphine gripped the balcony railing with anxious expressions, while 2 other nearby nobles also leaned forward to watch. Suddenly, the wolverine-faced noble stroked his chin and commented with a grin that the sword dance gathering could turn ugly. Down on the arena floor, Darius raised his sword, revealing the wing crest on the back of his hand as he mockingly stated that picking a fight with a ducal house was foolish and derided his opponent as a mongrel born in the wild who did not even understand the difference in power. Upon seeing his crest, the surrounding spectators shouted in excitement that it was a 4-wing crest and praised him as being on a completely different level, worthy of a ducal heir. Darius raised his brow in contempt and challenged Aster to reveal his own wing crest, pointing his sword at him and asking whether he was too embarrassed to show it after seeing Darius's. In response, Aster admitted dismissively that showing off a mere pattern with pride was not something he believed he could bring himself to do, staring coldly at Darius as he implied it would be shameful. This attitude enraged Darius, who ground his teeth as veins bulged across his forehead. Suddenly, Aster gripped his sword firmly and declared that if he won, Darius would apologize to his sisters, asking whether that sounded acceptable, addressing him as cousin. Darius agreed, stating that if he won, Aster would become his dog. He then wielded his twin swords and charged toward Aster, declaring that he would make him work for the rest of his life. Each of Darius's attacks descended as though he were toying with Aster, forcing Aster to leap backward repeatedly to evade them as white smoke swirled beneath his feet. Aster briefly glanced at the trembling hand that held his sword, yet his expression remained unchanged. On the other side, Darius crossed his twin swords to both sides, releasing a blazing red energy, and he laughed wickedly as he declared that it was the power of one who possessed it. He then launched a continuous series of attacks toward Aster, while the sound of clashing weapons rang loudly across the arena floor. Watching from above, Alphine turned pale and shouted Aster's name in alarm. Meanwhile, the Wolverine nobleman, witnessing the overwhelming dominance of Roderick's son, became even more excited and remarked that young Darius's swordsmanship was still immature. As thick clouds of dust engulfed the 2 fighters below and only the sounds of swords colliding could be heard, he admired that no matter how poor one's technique might be, the overwhelming mana of a wing crest could more than compensate for the difference. Imagining a brightly burning candle, the nobleman commented that if the mana of a single wing was like a candle flame, then the mana sealed within 4 wings was truly like an explosion. Observing Darius's frenzied techniques, he emphasized that it was indeed an explosion. Down in the arena, Darius continued striking with relentless sword attacks while mocking Aster, asking what had happened to the bravado he had shown earlier and questioning whether Aster had not intended to make him apologize or whether it had all been empty talk. Raising both swords high above his head, Darius roared for Aster to show him his power. Seeing this, the blonde nobleman began sweating heavily and concluded that the match was already decided. At that moment, Aster swung his sword and used his golden mana energy to block Darius's attack. As flames erupted between the three blades, Darius stared in shock and questioned what had just happened. Aster responded indifferently and mockingly that Darius talked too much. He then swung his sword powerfully, sending Darius flying into the air. At the same time, the mana surrounding Aster's sword surged violently. Holding his sword with one hand, Aster calmly counterattacked Darius while thinking that for the past 10 years he had learned to control mana in a Viscount's household, waiting for nothing but the chance to take revenge on him. With his golden eyes flashing with hostility and filled with hatred, Aster raised his sword, blazing with golden energy. He leapt into the air and struck down at Darius, forcing him to struggle desperately to defend himself. In an instant, the immense pressure caused Darius to drop to one knee. This scene caused Grion to turn pale, sweat pouring down his face as he muttered that his brother was... At that moment, like a demon glaring at its prey, Aster pressed Darius down with overwhelming energy, prompting Grion to cry out in shock, wondering whether his brother was being pushed back. Darius was drenched in sweat, yet his eyes grew even more frenzied as he gritted his teeth and declared that he had 4 wings. From above, Aster did not bother responding. Suddenly, Darius's sword emitted a dull, cracking sound and fractured. This caused everyone around them to turn pale and shout in disbelief, wondering whether he was actually going to win like that. Seeing Darius nearly leaning backward under the crushing force of Aster's mana, the crowd murmured that Darius was being overwhelmed in a one-sided manner. The spectators grew even more shocked, questioning whether Elmheim still had someone like that. Suddenly, Aster's energy flared violently, startling even himself. Viscount Highfried clenched his trembling hand and anxiously remarked that this was bad. Darius gritted his teeth as he watched Aster's blade inch closer and closer to his face. Meanwhile, Aster recalled the image of Darius smiling brightly as he had cut off Aster's arm in his previous life. The mocking expression of delight as Darius slaughtered his adopted younger brother without the slightest guilt resurfaced in his mind. Aster seemed to lose control, his pupils flashing with a blood-red glow as his energy erupted violently. Terrified by the sight, Darius panicked and shouted for him to stop. At the same time, from the upper level, Alphen screamed in horror, begging Aster to stop. Nevertheless, Aster's sword strike descended, causing a deafening explosion, and Darius's sword shattered and flew apart. The Wolverine nobleman frowned, no longer smiling or joking. In the courtyard, Aster had just finished his move when Darius's broken sword stabbed into the ground behind him. Meanwhile, Aster's blade had already sunk deep into the ground between Darius's legs. Darius collapsed onto the ground, urinating in fear, his entire body stiff and unable to move. Aster told him that next time he should come wearing some rags, something he would not mind getting soaked, and mockingly addressed him as his cousin. Afterward, Aster calmly sheathed his sword and thought to himself that he was no longer Ash the Wingless. Upstairs, Alphen was still leaning out over the balcony, sighing in relief, while Viscount Highfried placed a firm hand on her shoulder to hold her back. Aster looked up at them, smiled, and thought that simply realizing that was enough to clear his mind for the time being. Suddenly, Aster's pupils widened in horror. He sensed a powerful killing intent emanating from behind him. He quickly turned his head to look and inwardly panicked as he realized what it was. Immediately afterward, he saw the blazing fury and bloodlust radiating from Roderick, who stood on the staircase looking down, making no effort to conceal the dark, blood-like aura surrounding him. With a sharp, frozen gaze, Aster stiffened and internally called out Roderick's name. The onlookers, seeing Darius defeated by Aster on the arena floor, murmured that they could not believe the youngest son of a Viscount's family had actually managed to take down the main family's 3rd son. As they observed Roderick's approaching footsteps, they speculated that the situation had turned into a real mess, and that there was no way that person would remain silent after having their face dragged through the mud like this. Meanwhile, after sheathing his sword, Aster sternly looked in a certain direction and thought to himself that the man was the 8th head of the Elmheim main family. Sitting awkwardly on the ground, Darius suddenly smiled brightly when he saw who had arrived. Aster lifted his gaze and faced Roderick without any fear, while Roderick frowned, his displeasure clearly visible on his face. As a crimson aura radiated around Aster's body and his eyes refused to yield to Roderick's pressure, he silently identified him as Duke Roderick A. Elmheim. Suddenly, Darius pushed himself upright, bracing his body with one hand against the ground. He then lunged forward, grabbed Roderick's clothes, and shouted that it was his father. Darius pointed toward Aster and accused him, stammering that it was that man, the bastard who had dared to defy the main family despite being a filthy half-breed. Roderick's eyes flashed with fierce anger as his incompetent son continued rambling, begging his father to use his power to teach Aster a lesson. However, before he could finish, his hand was pinned to the ground by a sword sheath, shattering the tiles and causing blood to spurt out. Darius turned pale and froze in shock as he stared at his crushed hand. The surrounding crowd broke into cold sweats in terror, accompanied by Darius's piercing scream. Nearby, Grian widened his eyes and gaped in uncontrollable fear. A moment later, Roderick gripped his sword hilt and drew the blade, coldly demanding to know why the loser of the duel was laughing so shamelessly, stating that Darius had just dragged their family's name through the mud, and that one who could not even avenge themselves had no right to hold a sword. Seeing this, Viscount Highfried shouted in alarm for Roderick to stop, but Roderick still raised his sword and hissed that such a person had no right to wield a blade. A sharp slicing sound echoed through the deathly silent space. Darius broke into a cold sweat and stood speechless, his mouth hanging open. Roderick frowned and glared downward with furious red eyes. Seeing Aster use his own body to shield Darius, Roderick demanded to know what he thought he was doing. While clutching his head on the ground, Darius glanced upward as he heard Aster reply that his cousin still had not apologized to his sister yet. With unwavering eyes, Aster firmly requested that Roderick spare Darius's punishment until after he had done so, addressing him as uncle. Roderick flared with energy and sneered in contempt, remarking that Aster was merely an orphan picked up by Highfried, as he had heard, and questioning whether Aster truly believed he had become a member of the Elmheim family afterward. Thinking of Viscount Highfried, Aster resolutely declared that he was the Viscount's son, and that, even without a blood connection, he believed he had learned enough from his father about a knight's pride and the weight of a family name. Upon hearing this, Roderick glanced toward the second floor where his younger brother and niece were standing. However, his fury only intensified as he spoke through gritted teeth, stating that as a member of the Viscount's family, Aster had unnecessarily brought disgrace upon the main family's honor, reminding him of his majesty, the peak of 12,000 knights and the king's sword, and emphasizing that such pride was not something to be dismissed as a mere children's quarrel. A noble with Wolverine-like features crossed his arms and frowned as he looked down, while a blonde noble gasped and gripped the balcony railing as Roderick continued, insisting that Aster surely understood this was not something that could be brushed off lightly. Nearby, a blue-haired noble rested his chin on his hand and smirked as Roderick added that Aster himself must understand that. At the same time, Viscount Highfried placed his hand on his sword hilt, preparing to intervene as Roderick mentioned that Aster's father had given up an arm as compensation for his disloyalty. Down in the arena, Aster glanced at the sharp blade pressed against his neck as Viscount Highfried questioned what Aster intended to offer in return. Aster calmly began by respectfully addressing Roderick as uncle, then glanced toward Darius, who was still clutching his head behind him, and argued that this had not been a sibling quarrel, but a legitimate duel, stating that he had merely responded with his sword to words that had insulted his house. This statement only made Roderick grow even more displeased. Aster, however, very seriously asserted that those who could not take revenge for themselves had no right to pick up a sword, reminding his uncle that he himself had once said so, and declaring that he had no intention of losing even a single finger. His words caught the Wolverine noble off guard, prompting him to whistle in surprise, while Alphine, standing beside him, clenched her trembling hands. Suddenly, the blue-haired noble laughed and remarked in disbelief that the boy was only 10 and that it had to be a joke. Meanwhile, Roderick's expression darkened and he fell into silent contemplation. After a moment, Roderick turned around, sheathed his sword, and stated that he understood before abruptly instructing Aster to take his stance. Although confused, Aster still reached out and gripped the hilt of his sword. Without warning, a blade sliced through the air and closed in on Aster's face, horrifying him. Roderick remained standing still, yet the force he released sent Aster flying into the opposite wall, shattering it and filling the air with dust and smoke. The sudden flash of action left Alphine stunned and teary-eyed as she quickly covered her mouth in terror. Viscount Highfried, shocked, lunged forward and shouted Roderick's name while simultaneously striking toward him with a sword. Without even turning around, Roderick simply swung his sword backward and effortlessly blocked the Viscount's attack. The Viscount was knocked back but quickly leapt down, landing in front of Roderick. He then hurried toward the wreckage, calling out in panic as he asked whether Aster was all right. All he could see at first was the tip of Aster's sword stuck firmly into the ground, surrounded by scattered debris. Viscount Highfried broke out in a cold sweat, his eyes wide and mouth agape in shock. Through the white smoke, Aster emerged covered in grime, blood running down his face, yet his sword stance remained perfectly steady. Suddenly, his golden eye blurred. Roderick stared intently in that direction before turning and leaving. Ignoring Aster and his father, Roderick flicked his cloak and strode away in a grim mood, while Darius followed behind him, clutching his injured hand. As they ascended the stairs, Aster suddenly collapsed, startling Viscount Highfried, who quickly caught his son and anxiously called his name. However, Aster looked up with dull eyes and happily told his father that he had kept his word, as well as the promise and everything else. Hearing this, Viscount Highfried frowned unhappily and replied with a hint of sarcasm that Aster had indeed been magnificent. Meanwhile, as Roderick climbed the stairs leading to the second floor, the Wolverine noble glanced over and commented that Roderick's action had been rather childish. Darius gritted his teeth in frustration as the noble continued, explaining that if they had allowed the boy to speak as he pleased, the main family would have lost all face, and he wondered whether that had been a good point to end matters. Recalling Aster's resolute gaze when Roderick's sword had been held to his neck, the Wolverine noble reflected that, when faced with none other than Duke Roderick, the boy had boldly taken a stand and survived, calling him a rising star. Stroking his chin and narrowing his eyes with a smile, he added that, for the boy, it had been the best social debut he could have hoped for. Meanwhile, the blonde noble pointed and lamented that the boy had certainly frightened him, admitting that he had thought Elmheim might be split right down the middle. Suddenly, Roderick glared ahead and declared that an era of upheaval would eventually arrive, describing it as a storm fierce enough to split the world into 2 or 3 pieces. Back at the arena floor, Alfin anxiously ran toward Aster, while he simply smiled brightly as though nothing serious had happened. The sky was clear, and sunlight spread warmly across Viscount Highfried's land while the swordsman sweated profusely and stared ahead in astonishment. In the training yard, Aster struck with a palm attack, knocking his opponent's wooden sword away and sending him crashing to the ground. Despite being covered in dust, the opponent squinted and praised him, saying that Aster's performance was splendid, and he addressed him respectfully as young Master Aster. Outside the yard, spectators continued to marvel, remarking that Aster's skill was incredible and that it was frightening to think he was only 10 years old. They commented that ever since he had returned from the sword dance assembly, his training had become even more intense, suggesting that the event must have served as strong motivation for him. They also mentioned hearing that Aster had apparently defeated Duke Roderick's third son during the assembly. As they watched him train seriously, they continued to chatter, saying that the main family had looked down on them for years and that Aster's achievement was, at the very least, a refreshing story. Meanwhile, as Aster charged forward, he reflected that at the sword dance assembly he had displayed sufficient power and presence. As he repeatedly launched attacks against his training opponent, he reassured himself that this should silence those who mocked the Viscount family as a disgrace to the Elmheims. However, he acknowledged internally that the real obstacle remained the Elmheim main house. He admitted to himself that he had wanted to see how far Farmy's true strength could go. With determination in his eyes, he slashed down at his opponent, causing the man to break into a cold sweat while thinking that he had wanted to test himself further on that stage, but suddenly memories of his desperate struggle against Roderick resurfaced in his mind. He frowned, his gaze becoming firmer, lamenting inwardly that at his current level, he could not defeat Roderick. Gripping the wooden sword tightly, Aster rushed forward while reflecting that a wing crest was merely an indicator of the tier of one's hidden magical power. As he felt the energy from the wing marks on his back, he blamed himself, thinking that inborn magic was a wasted treasure if one could not master its use, and he regretted that he still had not been able to draw out the power of the 7 wings. Imagining the massive golden energy erupting from his body, he longed for a time when he would not have to worry about losing control and when he could test the 7 wings' power to his heart's content. Suddenly, his wooden sword swung powerfully, and with a single strike, Aster defeated another opponent. His golden eyes shone brightly as he turned sharply, and another wooden sword fell to the ground. Seeing that more than a dozen training opponents were already sprawled across the ground with their weapons scattered, he shouted, demanding to know if there was anyone else left to fight. At that moment, he was startled when someone commented that he was pushing himself hard again. Alfin, dressed in training attire, approached with a smile and remarked that he clearly did not understand the meaning of restraint, adding that their father was calling for him. Upon seeing her, Aster approached and asked whether their father had summoned him, then stated that he understood and would go immediately. As he walked past Alfin, he suddenly commented on her outfit. She turned her head in confusion and asked what he meant. Aster observed her from head to toe and noted that it was rare to see her wearing such clothing, reminding her that she had once said she disliked it because it was not cute. Hearing this, Alfin shrugged and explained that balance was important in everything, adding that watching him had made her realize that she could not remain the same either. She then pointed her sword toward Aster and, with a bright, challenging smile, told him that once he returned, he would have to spend plenty of time with her. Seeing this, Aster smiled happily and raised both hands in surrender, asking her to go easy on him. Sometime later, Aster knocked on the door of a room. After entering and facing Viscount Highfried, he politely excused himself. The Viscount turned toward him as Aster asked whether his father had wanted to see him, and Viscount Highfried responded by telling him to take a seat. Aster obediently sat down opposite the Viscount. Viscount Highfried closed his eyes and spoke seriously, asking whether it had already been 10 years since they had welcomed him into their home. Then, he suddenly placed an item on the table and admitted that he had originally thought about waiting until Aster was a bit older. Seeing the ring set with a large ruby in front of him, Aster asked in confusion what it was. Viscount Highfried looked straight at him and answered that it was the proof of the next head of the house, addressing him by name. He then shocked Aster by continuing that he wanted him to succeed the house of the Viscount. He further reflected that, as Aster already knew, the Viscount family was in a delicate position. Thinking of the vast fief under the evening light, he explained that they were still a branch family that carried the Elmheim name, no matter how flawed it might be, and that as lords entrusted with a territory, there was much they had to protect. As one of the 5 leaders, he added with melancholy that he could not leave the seat of the next head vacant forever. Hearing this, Aster suddenly interrupted and asked whether his sisters were okay with that decision. Viscount Highfried slightly lowered his head and replied that Aster's sisters, who had been away at the Night Academy, would return in 3 days, and that he planned to speak to everyone again at that time. Thinking about his 2 older sisters, Aster wondered to himself whether Sister Martha and Sister Kudo were coming back. Then he smiled and remarked that if that were the case, they would not be very happy about it, especially Sister Kudo, who would certainly be furious. He added that she despised him merely for happening to be born male and for happening to be blessed with the 7 wings. After that, Aster stood up and refused, stating that he could not accept the offer. Without showing any emotion on his face, he explained that he could not even control his own magic, and that he was still the immature brat who had almost killed his own sister. Finally, he expressed that he did not have the confidence to persuade his furious sisters under such circumstances. Upon hearing this, Viscount Highfried smiled and accepted his decision. Before Aster left the room, the Viscount called out after him, remarking that there were times when he truly doubted whether Aster had ever really been a child. Then he reached out and took out a box, explaining that he had intended the ring to be a reward for Aster's performance at the sword dance assembly. Aster saw Viscount Highfried place the wooden box on the table and explained that it seemed Aster might be more pleased with this instead. At the same time, Aster's pupils widened in surprise as he exclaimed in shock, asking what it was. Inside the box was a short sword inlaid with a diamond-shaped red ruby, with the tip wrapped in cloth. Viscount Highfried introduced it as the magic sword Gram, describing it as a magic-eating blade capable of controlling the power of the 7 wings. The story opened with Viscount Highfried holding the Gram sword as he led Aster into a forest, saying that the place should be fine. Aster asked suspiciously whether the dojo would have been enough if it was only to show the sword, but Highfried denied this, explaining that it was just in case. He then broke into a cold sweat as he recalled the ceiling and wall that had been left with a large hole, thinking to himself that Aster tended to destroy the house quite often. Highfried then presented the Gram sword, whose blade was still wrapped in cloth, explaining that the demonic sword Gram was a famed blade passed down only to the eldest sons of the Elmheim family, and that although it had been entrusted to the main family, he had it brought back specifically for Aster. After saying this, he used his teeth to pull away the cloth wrapped around the blade. Aster stared in astonishment when he realized that it was a broken sword and stammered in disbelief as he asked whether that was truly a sword. Highfried replied that, as Aster could see, the sword had no blade. As Aster continued listening in shock, Highfried explained that when magic power was poured into it, a crimson energy blade suddenly flared out from the hilt. Pointing the spiritual blade toward a nearby boulder, Highfried informed him that the sword was a potential blade that was completed by its owner's magic power. Suddenly, a massive pillar of blazing red energy shot forward, carving a straight path into the forest and causing the earth, rocks, and trees to vanish. Looking at the glowing red sword in his hand, Highfried frowned and warned that if the wielder's magic was half-hearted, the sword might instead drain all of it, adding that it was a sword with a dark reputation. After withdrawing the sword's energy, Highfried held it out in front of Aster and asked whether he wanted to try it. Aster immediately took the sword. Following Highfried's instructions, Aster focused on channeling his magic power into the sword. When he saw his golden energy erupt from it, he was startled and internally exclaimed in shock. Within his pupils, he saw the image of the sword absorbing his magic, making him question how his magic was flowing into the sword on its own. At the same time, several of Highfried's soldiers witnessed a red pillar of light shooting into the sky. They muttered in confusion, wondering what that light had been and whether a comet had fallen from the sky, while another soldier retorted that it was the opposite and that something had shot up into the sky. Seeing the light suddenly vanish while the others kept speculating, Alfin asked what they meant by something, before letting out a sigh and muttering that it must have been Aster. Meanwhile, Aster sat leaning against a tree, gripping the now depleted Gram sword with both hands and laughing awkwardly as he remarked that it was an unbelievable sword. Highfried, however, looked up at the sky in astonishment and began to comment on what was truly unbelievable before marveling at how the clouds had been split into a vortex and stating that it was Aster's power. Aster became serious again and looked up as Highfried explained that someone bearing the crest of the 7 wings had never appeared throughout the recorded Elmheim bloodline. Standing before Aster, Highfried declared that if Aster fully mastered that power, then one day he would become a swordsman far surpassing both himself, who possessed 6 wings, and Roderick. Thinking of his cruel adoptive father from his previous life, Aster frowned and reflected on the possibility of surpassing him. Highfried then warned that power that was too great would inevitably give birth to conflict. Recalling the wing marks on Aster's back, he added that if it became known that Aster possessed 7 wings, some people would envy him, others would resent him, some would scheme to use him, and others would try to eliminate him as an obstacle. Highfried then extended his hand toward Aster, saying that it was so Aster would not regret his helplessness when that time came. With a stern gaze, he encouraged Aster to grow strong now. Aster grasped his hand and resolved internally that he would not live another miserable life like his past one. With determined eyes, he expressed his gratitude to his father and declared that he would master both the 7 wings and the sword. 3 days later, the Viscountess stood beside her husband and Alphine, smiling as she welcomed the 2 older daughters back home and addressed them both. Kudryavka then stood at attention as if carrying out a military order and loudly declared that the unworthy Kudryavka had returned home. She then cleared her throat and changed her attitude. Narrowing her eyes into a bright smile, she spread her arms excitedly and invited her adorable little sisters to come for a reunion hug with their beloved big sister. Opening with the scene, Fren and Flair ran over and joyfully hugged Matha, welcoming Sister Malfa home, which made her happily respond with surprise and delight. Suddenly, the Viscountess spoke up in confusion, asking what about hugging Sister Kud. Hearing that, while still hugging Matha, Fren and Flair turned their heads and pouted, explaining that it was because Sister Kud always messed up their hair. This remark made Kudryavka feel startled, and she folded her arms, turned her head away, and defensively insisted that there was no way she, who had mastered chivalry to perfection, would ever do something so unrefined. At that moment, Kudryavka noticed Alphine standing to one side. She immediately rushed over, hugged Alphine tightly, and praised her by asking whether Afen had been a good girl. Being held by the head and having her hair rubbed, Alphine tried to push Kudryavka's hands away while complaining about why she was coming over there. Despite that, Kudryavka did not let go, causing Alphine to irritably tell her to stop it. Meanwhile, as Matha looked at the 4 of them, she suddenly realized Aster was missing and asked where he was. Viscount Highfried broke into a cold sweat and stammered that if she meant him, trailing off, which caused Kudryavka's gaze to become thoughtful before she glanced toward her father. Meanwhile, in the forest behind the manor, a thunderous explosion of energy erupted. Around Aster, white smoke swirled as energy continuously radiated from his sword. Covered in sweat, he panted heavily and clicked his tongue in frustration, admitting that it was still no good. Gripping the sword gram tightly, he muttered that he could form the sword with magic, but suppressing it was all he could manage. Looking at a mound of earth in the distance that had been hollowed out, Aster wondered how his father had done it so effortlessly. Suddenly, Kudryavka approached and interrupted him, remarking with amusement at how flashy it was. Retracting the energy from his sword, Aster turned toward her and remarked that she had returned, addressing her as Sister Kud. In response, she reproached him for not even showing up to greet his returning sister, then raised her eyebrow and teasingly commented that such behavior was awfully cold. Afterward, Kudryavka launched into a tirade, questioning whether they were not even worth noticing, or whether it was because he thought he was special. She stated that she had heard everything that had happened at the sword dance ceremony, and added that even at the Knight Academy, everyone had been talking about him, concluding that their father must be very proud. These words frightened Aster somewhat, prompting him to hurriedly change the subject by commenting that, on the other hand, he had heard she was already excelling in numerous missions despite still being a trainee. Looking at the golden emblem on Kudryavka's chest, he continued by stating that she alone had received that year's honorary knight medal, the Platinum Order. Hearing that, Kudryavka placed her hands on her hips, narrowed her eyes, and replied confidently that of course she had, adding that she could not otherwise inherit their father's position, which left Aster speechless. Suddenly, Kudryavka glared at him and stated that she had heard he had declined the matter of succession. Instantly, in his mind, Aster frowned in irritation, wondering whether she had been trying to spare him, noting that their father had told her, and thinking that it was such a troublesome thing to do. Outwardly, however, he explained that it had not been his intention, and that he had simply believed he lacked the qualifications for the time being. Hearing this, Kudryavka fell silent and did not respond. After a moment, she stepped forward and spoke honestly, saying that both their father and Aster, knowing full well what her dream was, were being cruel. Holding her sword like a baseball batter in contemplation, she made this statement, which caused Aster to turn pale as a bead of sweat rolled down his cheek. Immediately afterward, Kudryavka slammed her sword hard into the trunk of a tree, sending the entire massive tree crashing toward Aster. He hurriedly leapt aside to dodge it and, sliding across the ground, shouted in shock, asking what she was doing all of a sudden. From a distance, Kudryavka calmly responded that it had been a while and that she would let his big sister test him. Resting the sword on her shoulder, she smiled brightly and challenged him, declaring that next she would strike seriously. Seeing this, Aster broke into a cold sweat and urged her to wait, warning that the sword was still incomplete. However, Kudryavka raised her eyebrow and reproached him by asking whether he could make the same excuse when facing an enemy on the battlefield. Those words caused Aster to become confused as he repeated the word enemy in uncertainty. Kudryavka, who had slightly dropped to one knee while maintaining a training stance with one hand raised forward, reminded him that a knight must always consider themselves to be on the battlefield and warned that if he held back too much, she might crush him. A moment later, she leaped forward and vanished from her spot, causing Aster to be startled as he thought that this was no joke and that he was barely managing to control his magic as it was. At the same time, Aster noticed that Kudryavka had already swung her sword toward him. He immediately channeled energy into the sword Gram, telling himself that he had no choice and that if he did not act, his sister would be in serious danger. At that moment, Kudryavka, with an excited expression, slashed her sword down toward Aster's head with blue energy, and he realized that she was trying to kill him, prompting him to raise the sword Gram to block her attack.